This is an ABC podcast.
If you think about it, trees have a special place in the human imagination.
Suddenly you go inside of the tree canopy and it's humid and cool and the birds are singing everywhere. It's just like going to a different planet, and you can appreciate what the priests believe. They are the stewards of all of God's creatures as well as the human spirit.
But now, some religious communities are feeling the impact of deforestation.
Most of the forest in Asia is pretty much gone. And so to be in the middle of Australian bush and practicing in the way that the Buddha kind of instructed, it's an amazing opportunity.
Hello and welcome to Soul Search. I'm Meredith Lake, with you on RN to explore the forest as a sacred landscape. Yes, we're heading into the bush today, into the company of the trees, to find out how they matter to the religious communities that surround them. You heard Ajahn Khemavaro there. He's the abbot of a monastery in the forest tradition of Theravadin Buddhism, and he lives in relative seclusion among the eucalypts inside a New South Wales national park. We'll find out more about that a bit later in the program. First though, we're heading to northern Ethiopia, where thousands of local Orthodox churches are actually enveloped by trees. Dr. Meg Lowman is a canopy biologist working to conserve these amazing sanctuaries, because, as it turns out, they're all that's left of the huge forests that used to cover much of the region.
In Ethiopia, they call it the church forest because they want you to focus on the fact that surrounding every little tiny church are trees, and that's their local forest, which is so special. And if you flew over Ethiopia in a small plane, you would see amazing brown agricultural land with these teensy weensy green dots, and those are the church forests. Not much is left, less than say 4% in all of northern Ethiopia. So it's really kind of sad and scary because that's where all the native animals and plants and bugs live. So they need this desperately.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, this is the only remnant of, this was once a very forested part of the world, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely true. And so what's happened is because of droughts and locust plagues and, collecting firewood for mom's cook stove, areas have been cleared, and it's not an easy part of the world to grow crops, and they haven't had a lot of technology, very few, no tractors, very little irrigation. And so they've cleared and cleared and cleared. And all of a sudden we're down to something like 3% of these native forests. So it's a huge critical global issue because every country needs its native pollinators and native birds and native animals to grow sustainably and hunt. So it's a really critical time for Ethiopia.
Meg, you said that from the air you would see lots of these little green dots, these church forests. Are there many of them? Have you got a ballpark sense of that? And are these forests themselves very big?
Right. That's a great question. And in science, of course, everything has to be defined. And scientists argue, does a forest mean 10 trees or 100 trees or 1,000 trees? And nobody's still quite figured that one out. But overall, the green dots that you and I could see probably range between 20 and 30,000, which sounds huge. But just know that that is less than 3% of what used to be forest in Ethiopia. And they're all separated by miles and miles of brown soil and croplands, meaning the animals can't connect between them. So even though that number sounds high, a lot of them are dying back. And that's the scary part. The cattle get in and eat all the seedlings. The kids hunt the animals because they don't know how affected their region is. They have no maps or computers in school or any biology class telling them about the coverage of their forests in these rural schools. So we are losing these forests at a very high rate, and they're degrading because of all of the factors that are human caused. So that means that, the next 10 years is very critical for Ethiopia's heritage.
Dr. Lowman, I'd love to hear about the particular projects you're leading to address some of those issues. But before we get to that, I wonder if we could almost descend, if you like, down to ground level. I know you've been to northern Ethiopia several times. What's it like to actually walk into one of these church forests? What does it feel like? What do you find there?
Yeah, you're in a very hot, dry desert environment outside, and you get out of your four-wheel drive vehicle, or maybe you walk a mile because there's no road nearby, and you come to this green dot, and suddenly you go inside of the tree canopy, and it's humid and cool, and the birds are singing everywhere. It's just like going to a different planet. And you can appreciate in Ethiopia, that's what the priests believe. They are the stewards of all of God's creatures, as well as the human spirit, because when people go there to worship, they're transformed into this amazing Mother Nature sanctuary. And it's fabulous, and it's lively, and it's wonderful. And again, it's full of this, what I call, it's like the genetic library of Ethiopia, because all the species live there. And that means all the medicines are there. As I mentioned before, the pollinators are there for part of their lifestyle. A lot of the crops they need to harvest sustainably are being sown and grown there. So this is like a gold mine for the future of Ethiopia.
Dr. Meg Lowman is a canopy biologist, and her interest in the church forests grew out of her work in science and conservation. But as she hinted there with the mention of priests, this is also a story about religious traditions and communities. Ethiopia has a long historical connection to Christianity, stretching back at least to the 4th century AD. In fact, Ethiopia made Christianity its state religion before the Roman Emperor Constantine did. And over hundreds of years now, Ethiopian Orthodoxy has developed its own distinctive characteristics. These days, the church there still enjoys high rates of affiliation. About 2/3 of people in Ethiopia identify as Christians, and about 2/3 of those Christians are Ethiopian Orthodox. Most of the other Christians there are Protestants, typically Pentecostals. So I'm curious to hear more about the church part of these extraordinary church forests.
Well, it is their church, and Ethiopians are incredibly respectful, and the church is a huge part of their life. They go to church for baptisms, for celebrations, for funerals, for worship several times a week. And they walk many, many miles to go into these churches surrounded by these very small tracts of forest. So it's really important. And as you can imagine, for me, going there as the only female in the room, always, all the priests are male, almost always. I'd say 99% of the priests are male, and so are most of the government workers. And so in some ways the priests have kind of joked, oh my gosh, she must be an angel from heaven because I fly there. And of course that's something that's just for them hard to contemplate. And they have, very small budgets and are very modest, but they have this incredible trust of all the local people. And so over my 12 years working there, the most important thing for successful conservation is building trust with the local leaders, which are the priests, of course.
I would be really keen to hear about the actual church buildings. I looked up some of the photographs of these church forests, and I noticed that the church building itself, they're round, more like temples than a kind of space that you would accommodate a congregation in. Could you say a little bit about how the church itself organises its, well, I guess you might call it its sacred space?
Sure. And they are round. And inside are 3 round sections. The outer section is where the parishioners, the people come to worship. And then the intersection is for the disciples. And then the innermost circle way in the center is just for the priests. So they have these incredible delineations of sacred space. There's also a women's side and a men's side, different kinds of things that are important. But the round is very important because it makes everything equal. No corners, no edges, no, kind of ways that you could have any kind of bias. So it's really lovely and so special to see this architecture.
That idea of a centre where the priests might do their work reminds me of, almost the biblical descriptions of the temples back in almost biblical times, this idea of a holy of holies. And from the little I know about Orthodox Christianity in Ethiopia, kind of the example of ancient Judaism looms very large in the way that church community imagines itself in the world now. I believe they often have a replica Ark of the Covenant as a key symbol inside these churches. Have you ever seen that?
Yes, and that's in the innermost sanctum area. And of course, they believe the Ark of the Covenant, its original, is housed somewhere that nobody tells. But, again, as kind of a trusted disciple now, I have been privileged to be in part of the innermost areas. And I'm very humbled by all this. I spend more time praying in Ethiopia to save trees than I probably do planting seeds or anything, just because it's so important to respect their religion and to gain the trust of the priests. And that amazing history illustrates to us this is one of the older church kinds of disciplines in all of Africa. They pride themselves on being older than the Egyptian Orthodox. So it is a fascinating story for religious citizens, but now it's become a great story for conservation biologists too.
Do you think this is an example of what you might call a religious model of conservation? In many other parts of the world, conservation might be led or at least managed by governments. Here in Australia, for example, we have a long history of forming national parks. But the way you're talking about the churches and particularly the priests and the trust of worship communities suggests another pathway. Is that how you see it?
I do. And I see this as such a great example of what we call bottom-up conservation, meaning it's not the president of the country or the senators or the, parliament that's dictating how people will behave, but it's the priests working in the local communities and everybody is on the same page. And quite frankly, a lot of my science colleagues laughed at me when I started this project in 2008. They're like, church and science do not go together. You will have no success, because we all know that science is so different from religion. But to be honest, the priests are trying to care for all of God's creatures. I, as a scientist, am trying to conserve biodiversity. We actually do have the same mission. And I think it's really important to think to ourselves, if the church could become a vehicle for conservation in so many countries like Southeast Asia and India and Africa, where everybody is very religious and loyal to their religion, it could be a turning point for conservation.
What a thought. Could churches and other religious communities be the grassroots leaders of a new movement towards conservation? Well, years of work in northern Ethiopia has convinced Meg Lowman that the answer is yes. She's a world-leading forest scientist and executive director of the Tree Foundation, as well as my guest on Soul Search today as we continue our series on sacred landscapes, exploring religion, ecology, and the sometimes transformative connections between spirituality and place. I'm Meredith Lake, and coming up later in the show, we'll head to a Buddhist monastery tucked away in a national park to the north of Sydney. Why do the monks there seek seclusion in the forest? Stay with me on RN and by podcast to find out. But back to the church forests of northern Ethiopia now. How did Meg Lowman first become interested in their conservation?
I am, of course, a forest scientist. I actually specialize in the treetops. I have a book coming out in August called The Arbornaut with Macmillan that talks about Ethiopia, amongst other places in the world where I'm. Yeah, which is a person who studies the tops of trees. Astronauts study outer space. Arbonauts explore the treetops. And I guess I'm one of the world's first arbonauts. And I got my start in Australia, I might add. Dorrigo National Park, Royal National Park, all those places where are featured in my book. I went around the world. I ended up with this incredible global career thanks to my degree at Sydney University because nobody else studied the tops of trees. And so all of a sudden, here's this unexplored area. And that led me to many conferences, one of which I met the only conservation biologist in Northern Africa, a young man named Alamaihu Wasi Ashete, who burst into tears when I asked him about his forests. And he said, nobody's here. There's nobody helping save our forests. And of course, we kind of shook hands. What was I to do? And I promised him I would find some funds and come over and we would assess this. So I did engage some grants with National Geographic, and I went over and met with the head priest through my local colleague. Everything I think that's successful at a local level has to come from friendships and trust. And so this one local gentleman that really cared about his trees and was at an international conference with me is my key to success. It's nothing to do with me. It's everything to do with him taking me under his wing. And I'm the global voice. He's the local voice. And so together we can really cover the bases. Together we are a team. And I think that's what successful bottom-up conservation is all about.
Could you say a little bit more about the particular, very practical interventions that are emerging from these collaborations, from these friendships and partnerships that you're talking about?
Sure. The issue with these forests is the cattle and the goats and the sheep come in and eat all the seedlings. The kids trim the edge trees because they don't know that the next valley is a desert. They don't realize that their trees are at risk. And so the forests have become very degraded. And when my colleague, Alamaihu Wasi Ashete, and I gave workshops to the chief priests, they said, holy cow, we have gold in our forests called trees. We need to save these trees. So together we created this idea that if we could take stones out of the fields, the farmers are so happy. And if we build walls with these stones, we could save the trees from being invaded. And then we could give this boundary to all the local people, but we have to buy gates and we have to pay for the stones to be moved. And so lo and behold, I'm the fundraiser. My colleague is kind of the trust builder locally. And so now we're building these beautiful, beautiful stone walls around all the important forests, starting with the highest biodiversity forests and working our way backwards, because we really want to save all of the nature of Ethiopia behind these gorgeous stone walls.
Meg, I was looking at some photographs of some of the initial walls that you've been able to build. They look very similar to the inner walls that you were describing before surrounding the actual church building itself. It's another kind of dry stacked stone, quite a low wall. We're talking about waist height perhaps.
Right, 3 to 4 feet high. And it's very thick. It's about 2 feet wide. The locals are brilliant stonemasons and they have gorgeous stone and they're so proud of these dry walls. There's no cement involved. It's very simple, but very sturdy. And again, we have to have 4 gates, one on each north, south, east, west for people to come to church. But they will not go away. And the good news is if we've had a few churches that have expanded their forests, and because there's so much labor, so many people support the church and love the church, all the fellas came in and they just took the wall down and moved it out 50 feet and put it back up again. So there's not any kind of limitations to how we might expand these forests in the future.
I wonder if you could also see this in terms of the extension of that sacred space that you were describing before with the kind of the rings around the church. In a way, it's saying something very significant, I think, about the meaning of that forest around the church to kind of enclose it, at the same time open it with these walls.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very spiritual for the local people. And, it's so important we have respect for that. We are so careful as scientists to never tread when they're having ceremonies or funerals or church services, because that forest is part of their spiritual heritage. And I think wisely what they realize is they get their honey there, their coffee grows in the understory, they get their medicines out of these trees. So it really is their lifeblood to keep these little forests healthy. And that, I think, is interwoven with the spiritual appreciation of the church being the center of these life-giving trees.
You said you began with the forests that are richest in biodiversity and you're moving forward from there. What are the challenges for a project like this at this moment?
Oh my gosh. Well, mostly funding. Like, it's very hard to approach any foundation, including even the big ones like the Gates Foundation, and say, please help us save the trees of Ethiopia. The water is essential. The medicines are essential. The food is essential. The soil is essential. But people are like, oh no, we want to give people shots, or we want to provide textbooks to schools, or we want to, build roads. So, finding funders for this is so difficult. My biggest funders have been fifth graders. I do school talks all the time, mostly on Zoom in the last 2 years. And the kids see these pictures of Ethiopia losing the trees and they say, oh my gosh, we want to do a bake sale, or we want to do a little penny drive, and I get checks for $50 and $100. We've raised almost $250,000 to save the top 10 forests right now because of kids funding these projects. So the funding is very tough. And then taking the message to the local people there, when the kids in the schools in Ethiopia and even the priests have no computers, no textbooks, no science classes explaining how the food chain works and why the trees are important to the water quality. So we have to give them that message very quickly and impassioned so that they understand the importance of saving these things. So it is a pretty crazy project, but it's working. The good news is, I think this business of building trust and combining religion and science is a really successful option for the future of our planet.
Well, my final question, Meg, is to do with a nickname that I suspect many fifth graders would recognise. You've been described not only as an Arbonaut, but by National Geographic as a real-life Lorax, which is, of course, a reference to the Dr. Seuss character who speaks for the trees. How would you distill your love of trees, not just as a scientist, but, as a human being?
Oh, that's such a sweet question. And being a shy kid growing up in rural upstate New York, moving over to Australia to be the first canopy scientist there, I just feel so strongly about trees. I could relate to them because they don't talk. I didn't talk when I was a kid. And yet I found out from my work in the treetops in Australia that trees keep us alive. We have learned so much now. Half the biodiversity lives up there, the oxygen production, the carbon storage, the medicines, the foods that we get from trees. So I guess evolved to get my own voice all because of the trees. So I do feel so grateful to trees. And I'm a mom almost more than I am a scientist. I just really would like to leave the world a better place for my kids. And I know that means keeping the voice for trees alive and strong.
Dr. Meg Lowman, a world-renowned conservationist and canopy biologist who spent the best part of 40 years working to conserve trees and all that lives in them. She was the inaugural Chief of Science and Sustainability at the California Academy of Sciences, and since the year 2000, she's been Executive Director of the Tree Foundation. We've been hearing about her particular work to conserve the incredible church forests of northern Ethiopia, a project in partnership with local priests and with the forest scientist Dr. Alamahu Wasi Ashete. If you'd like to find out more or see some pictures of the church forests, just head to the Soul Search website for lots of further information. On Radio National and by podcast, you're listening to Soul Search, and the second of 3 special episodes on sacred landscapes. Last time, we dived into the seascapes of Pacific theology. Today, we're among the trees, where my next guest finds seclusion and cleansing for the mind. Ajahn Khemavaro is a monk at Wat Buddha Dhamma Monastery, a community in the forest tradition of Theravadin Buddhism. The monastery is located on 200 acres of bushland inside Darug National Park, north of Sydney, and from his phone, standing outside, Ajahn describes what it's like there on a sunny day in autumn.
Today is a particularly beautiful day, sunny, very quiet, a bit of wind, and just after the meal, going back to my hut, I actually saw 3 lyrebirds running around, and you're still heading towards the winter, so you might not see the goannas. Sometimes they're around during the hot weather. There's the sound of birds in the background, the rustling of the leaves of the trees. And we're a flat area in the kitchen and office area. And then it goes up to the hill where the monks' meditation huts are. So as monks, we live in individual huts, roughly about 2.5 by 3.5 meters. So it's enough for one person. Makes it easy to clean. You'll see native trees, angophas, turpentine, so mostly gum trees. Mostly, yeah.
It sounds beautiful, but at the same time, even apart from the animals and the community of monks that you've mentioned, it sounds quite isolated too. And I wonder if you could explain the role of seclusion to your community and to your practice.
Yeah, the Buddhists suggested that it's very important for young monks to have physical seclusion, to be away from the sounds of the cities and the villages back then. And it's good, especially in modern society, that also include being away from the mobile devices. Ask them to put that away when they come. And it's just allowing you some space, really, allowing the mind to be more still. Obviously, in theory, you can still the mind in any situation if you're a skilled meditator. But if you're starting out, as most people, it's important to have a quiet place to go to. Just natural sounds that doesn't grab you, doesn't allow the mind just to come out and get distracted. And sounds of nature is much more conducive to peace than kind of sounds of the cities. So it's physical seclusion is very important before mental seclusion can start.
Ajahn, you mentioned that you live at the monastery with a community of monks, but I wonder if you could describe the role of lay people in the community.
When the Buddha set up the monastery, because initially, he was just a wandering ascetic who walked from places to place to give teaching. And in the morning, he would go on an alms round to collect food, just basically receiving, accepting whatever was offered. But later on, as his ministry grew, he started to establish monasteries. So he saw the lay people grow as between the monastic and the lay community as a sign of a mutually beneficial relationship. We would recommend that the monks be away at the edge of the village to get some physical seclusion. But every day they would go on an alms round in the morning to the village to collect the food. And then they would go back to the monastery to practice, sitting and walking meditation. And for the lay people, the monks coming to a village would to represent, peace, an idea of, clarity and wisdom, and allows the lay people to also ask some questions if they had any. And whereas the lay community will provide the physical nourishment for the monastic, and the monks will provide the spiritual nourishment for the lay community to come and to practice meditation or to receive some teachings of Buddhism. So that's the relationship the Buddha envisaged between the monastic and the lay community. He would recommend that, it's one of our firm rules that in traditional Buddhist country, that monks would have to go on alms round every day. That's part of our duty. So you could, the monastery has to be like away from the village, but not too far that you can have to walk there once a day to collect the food.
Secluded from the city and yet in touch with the local village. But what's day-to-day life actually like for a monk in the Theravadin forest tradition?
Basically, we have a daily schedule. Wake up about 3:30, and then we're in a meditation hall by 4 o'clock. And there's a bit of morning chanting between 4 to about 4:20. After that is sitting and walking to 6 o'clock. At 6 o'clock, the monks have a hot drink, tea and coffee, or herbal drinks. And around 6:45, there will be a work meeting where we assign chores, a bit of raking, a bit of renovation work. Some people will be assigned to do some cooking. That's between 7 to 9:30. We all gather together to have the meal at 10 o'clock. And before the gathering, so the bell will be rung. The meals will be formally offered to the monks. We go out to get our food in an alms bowl. And then there's a brief chanting blessing for about 10-ish. We have the meal, clean up for noon o'clock or 12. And then we, between 12 and 5 is a rest period, personal time. And then there is evening tea at 5 o'clock. Then the evening session starts, 6 to 7 is a sitting or walking meditation. Evening chanting starts at 7, it goes for another 15 to 20 minutes. And then a bit of sitting and walking to 9 o'clock, where we formally end the session. And then there's some people can continue doing more meditation or have a rest. And then the next day starts again.
Ajahn, meditation is one of the hallmarks, really, of the forest tradition of Theravadin Buddhism, along with discipline and renunciation. And I wonder if you could say a bit about that forest tradition, because I understand it's both very old, but also rather strict.
It is. It depends on your perspective. I think I like to emphasize is, we live in a day and age where freedom to do what we want, to go where we want, to see who we want to see, to date. And we kind of cherish that freedom. We call it freedom of desires, to do what you want to do, whatever you want to do. And somehow that is enshrined. We think that makes us happier. But actually, in the forest tradition, we emphasize the freedom from desire. So there's freedom through structure of giving yourself up. Because I do often ask people, people come to the monastery, say, well, you've been doing whatever you want to do most of your life. And how's that turning out? Are you happier? And ironically, most people aren't happy. We live in a world that is self-obsessed. The more we obsess about ourselves, making me happy, me and my moods, my wanting, my craving, the more we focus on that, the more that expands. And the more we feel more tired, empty after a while. But live in a world where you restrain that. You can acknowledge there's desire. You don't have to act on it. And you focus on something more still, more peaceful. Or you can be a life of service, looking around to see how you can help others in some small ways. And most people found that more fulfilling.
Ajahn, you're talking about how this tradition is important to the world. How is it important, particularly to Buddhism?
I think, Buddhism, like most religion, like you become overly organized as time goes on. And there's an emphasis on a lot of kind of external, lots of building in monasteries, lots of activities, lots of rites and ritual. But a lot of time they're missing the important bit. The crux of Buddhism is, self-reflection and seclusion and looking inward. And if we forget that, then the tradition starts to degrade over long periods of time. So the forest tradition is a good way to kind of come back to the basics and come back to how the Buddha lived when he was alive. He mostly lived in the forest. He was born in the forest, became enlightened in the forest, lived most of his life in the forest, and he died in the forest. We don't forget that physical seclusion is something that is essential to reach the inner mental seclusion from the forces of greed, hatred, and delusion.
Your point about how the Buddha was born in the forest, lived in the forest, was enlightened in the forest, raises a really interesting question about whether the forest tradition, in a sense, predates the Buddha, in that perhaps there was already a tradition of spiritual searching in ancient India that was connected to kind of wandering in the forest. Would you comment on that?
As far as I can tell, there is in India a very kind of lively and rich spiritual tradition of wandering sadhus. People walk around from place to place. And back then, majority of India would be forested. So yes, the Buddha kind of worked within the system that he was born into. And definitely that was being wandering in the forest from place to place, often teaching where he can.
I understand that there are 13 special practices associated with the forest tradition. Could you just introduce us to Dhutanga, as I believe it's called?
The Buddha encouraged monks to undertake one or several of these practices from time to time to strengthen their meditation practice. The common one is to have one set of robes. So we have a sarong, and then we have a thicker overcoat, and a double kind of layered overcoat as a blanket as well. So to keep one of those, not to have more than that. The other one is eating from an alms bowl once a day. So you put everything, all the food you have in the bowl, and eat that one sitting. You don't get up until you're finished. If you get up, that's the end of the meal. Another one, it would be living at the root of a tree. So you wouldn't have a hut to go to. You would just live in the root of a tree to keep things simple. Another one would be not lying down. You would practice in the 3 postures only: sitting, walking, or standing. Refrain from lying down. You could sleep, but we sleep sitting, leaning on the wall or something. That is also another Dhutanga practice.
You mentioned living at the root of a tree, and I'd love to just look a little bit more closely at the significance of particular trees, say in the Lord Buddha's life. Buddhist texts describe the Buddha's mother holding a branch of the sal tree when she went into labour. Would you speak about the sal tree?
Legends has it that while the Buddha's mother was pregnant, she was going back to her homeland to deliver, but she never made it. And on the way there, she gave birth to the Buddha standing up, holding on to the sal tree. So the Buddha was born on the sal tree. I do know that in terms of the Bodhi tree, that's where the Buddha became enlightened. I'm not sure whether the Bodhi tree in itself has any more significance. But sometimes there is kind of the middle way where it's important to be in the forest, to be in quiet, but we don't veer towards like the forest itself has some kind of magical power or some kind of energy outside of our mind. The forest is a great mirror in that it brings us to reflect inward into our mind, to learn what are the ways that we are making suffering for ourselves and others, and to cleanse those forces inside.
Ajahn Khemavaro, who sees the forest as a mirror for inward reflection. Speaking to me from Wat Buddha Dhamma, a monastery in Darug National Park near Wiseman's Ferry, north of Sydney. I'm Meredith Lake, and on Soul Search today, we're exploring the forest as a spiritual sanctuary and as a mirror. Part 2 of our series on sacred landscapes. Thinking about the forest in those terms as a kind of mirror for reflection inward, how much does it matter, for example, that this forest tradition is now practiced in Australia among eucalyptus trees? Do you find that the tradition translates easily to a new environment among new trees?
It does. One of the things that I remind the lay people, even the monks here, I think it's a wonderful thing. It really rocks that we're in the middle of the Australian bush, 2,500 plus years, since the Buddha became enlightened. And we're still practicing pretty much in the same ways that the Buddha did. And the fact that Buddhism translates so well across time and culture, and that Australia is particularly kind of a good fit for the forest tradition because there's so much forest around. It's a low population density area. And in Asia, where I was trained in Thailand or where I grew up in Vietnam, to have hundreds of acres to be able to practice in something very, very rare, as you may know. Most of the forest in Asia is pretty much gone. And so to be in the middle of Australian bush and practicing in the way that the Buddha kind of instructed, it's an amazing opportunity and a great blessing that I always remind people that, put in a lot of effort because you don't know what's around the corner. And we're quite lucky to have these wonderful forests, next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Look at Asia, it all disappear very quickly. So, make use of the time that you have right now.
It raises the question, doesn't it, about the future of this tradition. Is deforestation one of the major threats?
We see things as, the core teaching of the Buddha is impermanent. And yes, climate change is definitely a threat, but there are many threats on your way to enlightenment. Climate change or deforestation is certainly part of that. But so is the modern technology, if you're not careful with it. Before you're in the forest and you're really quiet. But now these mobile devices, sure, it gives you an opportunity for me to do my interview. But if you're not careful, it reaches all the way into your hut. Whereas, something that 20, 30 years ago, that's not possible. Once you're in your hut, you're in your hut. But now the world comes to you through these devices. You're not careful. So there are always distractions if you allow that to happen, if you're not restrained.
Ajahn, you mentioned that you were born in Vietnam and then did your training in Thailand. And I understand that it was in Thailand, and particularly in the northeast of Thailand, that the contemporary forest tradition, as it's been revived in the last 100 years or so, it came out of that part of the world. Why do you think the forest tradition has been so popular in Thailand? And could you talk to us a little bit about Ajahn Chah, who was one of the masters, really, of that tradition?
I think with Buddhism and most organized religion or with any religion, it has its waves of kind of lots of support, lots of enthusiasm. And then it wanes, it gets corrupted with popularity, with wealth and fame. There comes corruption and people get distracted. And then that gets, moves away from that. So what happened about 150 years ago was actually Ajahn Mun, who precedes Ajahn Chah. He pretty much restarted the whole forest tradition. He came from a city monastery, and he became inspired by reading the old text to go off in the forest to practice. And then after, I think, 15, 20 years, there was some kind of deep realization. And then he started teaching other people. So he had a following. Different monks would follow him into the forest, get some teaching, and then would send them away. So that starts to build up. So he's pretty much single-handedly restarted the forest tradition in Thailand about 150 years ago. He passed away in 1947. And Ajahn Chah was one of his students. But even though Ajahn Chah only lived with him for 3 days, he also came from a city monastery, but also did a lot of practice in the forest by himself for 15 to 20 years. And from that, the Ajahn Chah also had, a lot of deep realization. After he was wandering around 20, 25 years, he went back home to his home village and started Wat Nong Pha, which is the main monastery. He was a very charismatic teacher, so a lot of students, a lot of followers to come, and they would start offering land everywhere. So he had about 30 branch monasteries by the time he died in the 1992. He was part of that wave of forest monks who practiced in the forest, so really strong meditation, and could lead people, could teach in different ways. And one of Ajahn Chah's gifts was that he could teach Westerners in a way that maybe other Thai teachers couldn't bridge the cultural gap. And so now Ajahn Chah's tradition is kind of spread over the world, to England, to the US, the EU, and of course to Australia.
In the footsteps of Ajahn Mun and Ajahn Chah, the monks who led the revival of the forest tradition of Theravadin Buddhism as a way of getting back to what they saw as the basics of Buddhism, that's Ajahn Khemavaro, the present abbot of Wat Buddha Dhamma, a forest monastery among the trees of Darug National Park to the north of Sydney. Well, having heard about what Ajahn life is like now, let's find out where his own journey to Buddhism began. What happened to the former stockbroker who once smuggled cigarettes to a friend on a Buddhist retreat?
I grew up actually in a Catholic family. Went to Catholic school even for a few years. But mostly growing up, moving from Vietnam to the US about 1975. And with any immigrant family, you're busy kind of, making your way. So through high school, there was a period when we went to church a lot. But mostly as you get to high school, I think that's kind of died out. We're busy with other activities kind of after school. Just go to church on Christmas Eve, Easter, maybe. And I was a stockbroker in Thailand. And I think back then had, Buddhist friends. But, being Catholic, had kind of a mild interest in Buddhism. And I remember in Bangkok, as kind of a young man going to work and partying, we would leave the clubs about 4 or 5 in the morning. And that's where you see the monks walking on alms round. So we were always encouraged to put some food in the bowl. And they were kind of jokingly say, all the bad karma we made this evening, we have to balance it out by giving the food to the monks. So we get some bite of food on our way back and put it in the monk's bowl. So that's extent of my Buddhism. And then I think I had a friend in the US. He was visiting, and he'd done the bars and beaches. So with any kind of tourist, you were kind of bored after a while. So looking for something new. So one day he flipped through an English language newspaper, and it said that you can become a monk for 2 weeks in a monastery. He's like, oh yeah, I haven't done that before. That'd be interesting. And something different to tell your friends. So he had a mild interest in Buddhism. So when he got there, he didn't know there was no TV. He couldn't smoke. And couldn't do much. So
That's a
he's
shock.
totally bored. That's why he was totally bored, he said. So that's what he called me. It's like, I'm really bored and I've got another week to go. Why don't you come in and keep me company and bring some cigarettes too. So I would come in and keep him company. And that's when I met the monk. And he started explaining, the teaching of Buddhism and meditation. And it got me really interested.
That's a terrific story. Smuggling cigarettes into a monastery and ending up further down the track, a monk yourself. I mean, that was a couple of decades ago now. And I mean, for 20 years, you've lived this very, very seriously. And just in closing, I wonder where you see the future of the forest tradition. We were talking before about the relationship of the forest tradition and its practice to a wider world. I guess one of the ways that a secluded community might serve its neighbours is by living out a contrast to the mainstream's values and culture. And in that context, what do you see as the future for the forest tradition in a world that is dealing with climate change?
I think, as you might know, staring into the crystal ball of the future is a bit of always kind of a risky task. It's very uncertain. But as far as I can tell or extrapolate, especially during this pandemic, where there is a great need actually for centers like ours. We had double, triple amount of people coming to the monastery during the pandemic. Mostly at first because obviously they were out of a job. And second, because of the level of stress that people had to deal with, of the unknown. So, and that was a kind of great opportunity for us just to be able to allow people to come to a quiet place and to sort out all the noise of what's happening in their life and to learn to adapt, to change to the situation. And what the pandemic remind everybody is that, life is uncertain. It's not a sure thing. These buildings might look very solid. The body might look solid. But all it took was a few little bugs to shook everybody up. Even about great technology, we cannot make things certain. That's not a possibility. You have a body, you have a building, they're going to be affected by change. Either way, sometimes it's slow and gradual. Other times it can be very drastic. Life is constantly changing. And that isn't the problem. Change isn't the problem. It's the fact that we attach and we think it should be in a certain way. But if you learn to train the mind, learn to look at the world in a certain way, and to accept change as part of life, then we can learn to live with it, learn to adapt when we have to. Yes, we can't go out anymore. We can't hug people. But it's not the end of the world. You can look at the positive things. There's still lots of things that we can do. And it also encourages people just to spend, some quiet time in the forest, to learn to energize your mind, to, look out for your mental health. If you have a healthy mind, you can cope with anything that comes up. And that's much more important.
Ajahn Khemavaro is the abbot of Wat Buddha Dhamma, a monastery in the forest tradition of Theravadin Buddhism. His monastery is literally located in a forest among the eucalypts of Darug National Park, a few hours to the north of Sydney. Ajahn described the bush, or the forest, as a kind of mirror, a surface for reflecting inward on the mind. Earlier today, I spoke with canopy biologist Meg Lowman, who's working to conserve the incredible church forests of northern Ethiopia. For communities there, the church forest is a kind of sanctuary, a cradle of life in the fullest sense, cared for by the priests. An amazing example of grassroots conservation and of the ways that place and spirituality can be bound up with each other. If you missed it, catch up with the Soul Search podcast and do head to our website this week to see some pictures. Next time on the show, we're continuing our series on sacred landscapes by heading into the mountains. For now, thanks to producers Hong Jiang and Mudita Dias, Andrei Shabanov was the sound engineer today. I'm Meredith Lake, signing off from Soul Search here on RN, your home of ideas.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio, and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.